Welcome the viewer with a relaxing invitation to settle in. Invite them to imagine standing on a quiet hill overlooking Constantinople at sunrise. The sea is calm, church bells echo softly. Merchants are only beginning to open their shops, and the world's greatest city slowly awakens. Explain that tonight's journey isn't about spectacular battles or legendary heroes. Instead, it follows an empire that quietly survived for more than 1,000 years, while countless kingdoms appeared and disappeared around it. Mention that while Western Europe experienced chaos after Rome's collapse, another Roman Empire continued living almost unnoticed. Introduce the central question. How did the Byzantine Empire quietly survive for over a millennium? And why did it finally disappear when Rome didn't actually fall? When most people think about the fall of Rome, they imagine something dramatic. A single terrible day, a city in flames, an emperor dropping his crown, people running through the streets while everything that had stood for centuries suddenly disappeared. It makes for a wonderful movie scene. The only small problem is that is not really what happened. History is often much quieter than we imagine. The year 476 is usually given as the official end of the Western Roman Empire. If you have ever opened a history textbook, there's a good chance you have seen that date sitting proudly on the page, almost like someone pressed a giant game over button. But history rarely works that way. Imagine your favorite old family business. One location closes after years of struggling. The sign comes down, the windows are boarded up, and everyone assumes the business is finished. Meanwhile, across town, another branch is still open. The lights are on, the workers arrive every morning, customers continue shopping, the accountants are still counting coins. Deliveries still arrive on schedule. Life simply goes on. That is a little like what happened to Rome. While the western half slowly unraveled under pressure from political problems, economic troubles, and repeated invasions, the eastern half continued almost as if someone had forgotten to tell them that the empire was supposed to be ending. It remained wealthy, it remained organized, and perhaps, most surprisingly of all, it remained confident. Its people did not wake up one morning thinking they lived in a brand new civilization. As far as they were concerned, they were still Romans. The emperor was still Roman. The laws were still Roman. The government was still Roman. Even the taxes, which, unfortunately, were also very Roman, continued arriving right on time. For the people living there, Rome had not disappeared. It had simply changed its address. That new address was one of the greatest cities the world has ever known, Constantinople. Before it became the heart of an empire, it had been a smaller Greek city called Byzantium. It occupied a remarkable piece of land where Europe and Asia almost reach out to shake hands. Standing there today, you can still see why generations of rulers admired this place. Water surrounds much of the city. The deep blue waters of the Bosporus stretch north and south, linking the Black Sea with the Mediterranean world. Every ship passing between those two great bodies of water had little choice but to sail nearby. That alone made the location incredibly valuable. Imagine owning the busiest bridge in an entire country. Everyone eventually has to cross it. Merchants carrying silk, farmers bringing grain, sailors transporting wine, travelers searching for new opportunities, ambassadors delivering important letters. They all pass through these waters, and where merchants gather, money usually follows. The Bosporus itself is not especially wide, but it is enormously important. Its currents move constantly, carrying ships between continents. Standing on its shores, someone could watch vessels arriving from lands that seemed unimaginably distant. Some came from Egypt carrying grain. Others sailed from the Black Sea with timber, fish, and valuable goods. Still others brought spices, fabrics, metals, and stories, collected from thousands of miles away. Every arriving ship carried more than cargo. It carried news, ideas, languages, customs. The world came floating into Constantinople every single day. On one side stood Europe, on the other stood Asia. Very few cities have ever occupied such an extraordinary crossroads. But water alone was not enough. The city also possessed one of nature's greatest gifts, a magnificent natural harbor, known today as the Golden Horn. Unlike many open coastlines where rough waves could make life difficult, this harbor offered calm, sheltered waters. Ships could anchor safely, cargo could be unloaded more easily, repair work could be completed without battling heavy seas. Even during storms, the harbor provided protection. For merchants, that was priceless. For emperors, it was even better, because wherever merchants gathered, governments could collect taxes. The Roman government became exceptionally good at collecting taxes. Some traditions never really change. As the city grew richer, it also became stronger. Constantine understood something that many rulers before him had overlooked. A capital city should not only be beautiful, it should also be difficult to attack. Constantinople sat on a peninsula. Water defended it on three sides. Any invading army approaching from land faced another remarkable obstacle: the massive land walls. These were not ordinary walls. They stretched for miles, built with enormous stone blocks and strengthened over generations. They became one of history's greatest defensive systems. Moats stood before them. Tower after tower watched the countryside. Several layers of defenses forced attackers to overcome obstacle after obstacle before they could even think about entering the city. For centuries, countless armies looked upon those walls with hope. Most eventually looked upon them with disappointment. Some probably wished they had chosen an easier hobby. The walls gave Constantinople something precious: time. Even if an enemy arrived unexpectedly, defenders could prepare. If you arrived in Constantinople just before sunrise, you might think the city was still asleep. The streets would be quiet. The sea would be almost perfectly still, with only the gentle sound of water touching the docks. A cool breeze would drift in from the Bosporus, carrying the salty smell of the sea. For a few peaceful moments, the greatest city in Europe would feel surprisingly calm. Then slowly, the city would begin to wake. A fisherman would untie his small boat. A baker would slide fresh loaves into a hot oven. A stable boy would sweep yesterday's dust from the street. One window would open, then another. Soon the quiet streets would fill with footsteps instead of silence. This was not the noisy rush of a modern city. People moved with purpose, but not with panic. There were no engines roaring, no phones ringing, no one trying to answer 20 messages before breakfast. The loudest thing in the morning might simply be a cart with one squeaky wheel, and somewhere in the distance, someone would probably already be arguing about the price of onions. Some things never change. As daylight spread across the rooftops, the markets slowly came alive. Merchants rolled back wooden shutters. Cloth sellers carefully unfolded colorful fabrics. Fruit sellers arranged baskets of grapes, figs, apples, and olives until everything looked almost too perfect to eat. The smell of fresh bread floated through the streets, mixing with herbs, spices, and warm honey. It was the kind of place where every corner offered something interesting. One stall displayed shining glass cups. Another sold handmade sandals. Nearby, a metalworker hammered copper into bowls that caught the morning sunlight. Children followed their parents through narrow streets, occasionally stopping to stare at a toy or a sweet they hoped someone might buy for them. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it did not. Parents have been saying, maybe next time, for thousands of years. The markets were much more than places to buy food. They were places to hear news. Travelers shared stories from distant lands. Sailors talked about storms at sea. Officials announced new laws. Neighbors exchanged gossip that somehow traveled across the city faster than any official message ever could. If you wanted to know what was happening in the empire, spending an hour in the marketplace was probably more useful than reading a long report. Not far away, the harbor was already full of life. Ships arrived one after another, their sails catching the morning light. Some were large trading vessels loaded with valuable cargo. Others were small fishing boats returning with the day's first catch. Dock workers lifted heavy crates onto their shoulders. Ropes creaked, wooden ships gently bumped against the piers. Seagulls circled overhead, always hopeful that someone might accidentally drop lunch. The harbor never stayed quiet for long. It was one of the busiest places in the entire empire. Every arriving ship connected Constantinople to another part of the world. Some vessels came from Egypt. Their holds were packed with grain that helped feed hundreds of thousands of people. Without these shipments, life in the city would have become much harder. Other ships crossed from Persia, bringing fine carpets, precious stones, beautiful metalwork, and ideas from lands far beyond the eastern mountains. Merchants from Arabia arrived with fragrant spices, perfumes, incense, and rare goods that filled the air with unfamiliar scents. Even before seeing their cargo, you might smell them arriving. Then there were the traders, whose journeys had taken months. Some came from India, carrying pepper, cinnamon, cotton cloth, ivory, and other treasures that seemed almost magical to European buyers. Others traveled from Central Asia, leading long caravans filled with silk, horses, furs, and stories gathered across endless deserts and high mountain passes. Many had crossed rivers, climbed dangerous roads, and survived harsh weather simply to reach this remarkable city. By the time all these goods reached Constantinople, they had already traveled farther than most people would travel in their entire lives, and then, after being bought and sold again, many continued west toward Europe. Constantinople stood right in the middle of this incredible movement. It was like the world's busiest front door, only instead of receiving pizza deliveries, it welcomed entire civilizations. Walking deeper into the city, another sound would begin to fill the air. Church bells. Their steady ringing echoed across rooftops and narrow streets. People paused for prayer. Monks walked quietly toward monasteries. Families entered churches, lighting candles before beginning the day's work. Faith was woven into everyday life. It shaped the calendar, the festivals, the holidays, and even the rhythm of an ordinary morning. The bells reminded everyone that the city was not only rich, it was deeply spiritual as well. Not every building was devoted to business or worship. Some people preferred a slower way to spend the afternoon. The public baths remained popular gathering places. Visitors came not only to wash, but also to relax. Friends talked while warm water eased tired muscles. Business deals were discussed. Neighbors caught up on local news. Sometimes people probably stayed much longer than they planned. After all, leaving warm water has never been anyone's favorite activity. The city also valued learning. Libraries preserved countless books copied carefully by hand. Long before printing presses existed, every page required patience. Skilled scribes spent hours copying ancient works one line at a time. Thanks to them, knowledge survived generation after generation. Students studied history, mathematics, philosophy, medicine, and religion. Scholars debated ideas that had first been discussed centuries earlier. In many ways, Constantinople became a bridge carrying ancient knowledge into the future. One quiet change could even be heard in the streets. The language around you was changing. Long ago, Latin had been the language of Roman government. Official documents, military commands, and imperial business often used it. But over time, Greek became the everyday language of the empire. Shopkeepers spoke Greek. Teachers taught in Greek. Children played in Greek. Writers produced books in Greek. Even many emperors spoke it naturally. The empire still proudly called itself Roman. Its traditions remained Roman. Its laws remained Roman, yet its daily voice had become Greek. It was not a sudden change. It happened slowly, almost unnoticed, across generations. Perhaps that is how many great changes happen. No one notices them while they are taking place. Only centuries later do people look back and realize how much has changed. This mixture made Constantinople unlike almost anywhere else. European travelers arrived wearing one style of clothing. Asian merchants arrived wearing another. Different foods filled the markets. Different accents echoed through the streets. Different customs met one another every single day. Yet, somehow the city held them all together. A person could spend one morning speaking with an Egyptian grain merchant, share lunch with a trader from Persia, buy spices from Arabia, admire silk that had crossed Central Asia, and hear stories that began in India. Very few places on earth could offer such a journey without anyone leaving the city walls. That was the true strength of Constantinople. It did not become rich simply because it had strong walls or wise emperors. It became rich because the world came to it. Goods, people, languages, ideas, and cultures all met here. Europe reached east, Asia reached west, and right between them stood a city that quietly welcomed both, growing wealthier with every ship that entered its harbor and every traveler who stepped through its gates. By the time Constantinople had become the shining heart of the Roman Empire, many emperors had already come and gone. Some ruled wisely, some ruled poorly. Some were remembered for great victories. Others were remembered for making everyone wonder how they ever got the job in the first place. Then came a man named Justinian. If history had a category called people who never believed in small goals, Justinian would almost certainly win first place. He did not want to improve the empire a little. He wanted to restore all of it, not part of the old Roman Empire, all of it. It was a dream so large that even many of his advisors probably looked at each other and quietly thought, "That's a very ambitious to-do list." Still, Justinian believed it could be done. He became emperor in the year 527, ruling from the Grand Palace overlooking the Bosporus. From there, he watched ships arrive from every corner of the known world. He governed a city filled with wealth, learning, and trade. But Justinian was not satisfied with simply protecting what already existed. He constantly looked backward, not in a sad way, more in the way someone looks at an old family photo and says, "We used to own a lot more land." For Justinian, ancient Rome was not just history, it was unfinished business. He believed the empire should once again stretch across the Mediterranean, just as it had centuries before. To him, Rome had not truly disappeared. It had simply become smaller than it ought to be. But rebuilding an empire required far more than dreams. It required organization, planning, money, and an endless supply of paperwork. History often celebrates kings with swords. In reality, empires survive because someone remembers to keep records, collect taxes, repair roads, and make sure officials actually know what they are supposed to do. Justinian understood this very well. He spent enormous amounts of energy improving the government itself. One of his greatest achievements had nothing to do with castles or armies. It was the law. Over hundreds of years, Roman law had become incredibly complicated. Imagine adding new rules every year for centuries without throwing away the old ones. Eventually, finding the right law would be like searching for one specific shell on an enormous beach. Judges struggled. Officials argued. Lawyers probably stayed very busy. Justinian decided enough was enough. He ordered scholars to gather, organize, and simplify centuries of Roman laws. The result became one of history's most important legal collections. Instead of thousands of scattered rules, people now had a clear system that could actually be understood. This massive project preserved Roman legal thinking long after the empire itself disappeared. Centuries later, many European legal systems would still borrow ideas from Justinian's work. That is quite an achievement for something involving paperwork. Sometimes boring documents quietly change the world more than exciting battles ever do. But Justinian was not finished. Far from it. If there was one building that perfectly captured his ambition, it was Hagia Sophia. Today, visitors still stand beneath its enormous dome and instinctively look upward. It has that effect on people. When Justinian ordered its construction, he wanted something unlike anything the world had ever seen. Not simply another church, a masterpiece. Builders, architects, engineers, artists, and craftsmen came together to create something extraordinary. They worked with marble from distant lands, columns taken from older temples, brilliant mosaics that shimmered whenever sunlight entered through the windows. The great dome seemed almost impossible. It appeared to float high above the floor, supported by light itself. People entering the building often struggled to describe what they were seeing. Some believed they had stepped into a glimpse of heaven. Construction was difficult. The project demanded enormous skill. Thousands of workers labored for years. Mistakes had to be corrected. New ideas were tested. Problems appeared almost daily. Yet somehow the building rose, higher and higher, until it dominated Constantinople's skyline. When it was finally completed, Justinian reportedly looked around with enormous pride. Whether every famous quote about that moment is perfectly true is difficult to know, but no one doubts how deeply proud he felt. Hagia Sophia became the symbol of an empire at the height of its confidence. It still reminds the world what Byzantine builders could accomplish over 1,400 years later. Of course, beautiful buildings are rarely inexpensive. Neither are grand political dreams. Justinian's plans required money, a great deal of it. Roads needed repairs, officials needed salaries, public works required funding, the church received support. The palace had expenses, and rebuilding Roman greatness did not come cheaply. So taxes became heavier. Collectors traveled across the empire gathering revenue from cities, farms, merchants, and landowners. Few people enjoy paying taxes today. The people of Justinian's empire were not especially different. For wealthy merchants, the payments could be frustrating. For ordinary farmers, they could feel overwhelming. Every harvest mattered, every coin counted. Some communities managed well, others struggled beneath the growing financial burden. From Justinian's point of view, these sacrifices served a greater purpose. He believed the empire's future depended on them. But for many ordinary families, it was difficult to appreciate long-term imperial dreams when this year's taxes were already knocking at the door. Alongside these reforms came Justinian's desire to recover lands that had once belonged to Rome. His officials carefully planned campaigns to bring former Western provinces back under imperial control. The goal was not simply conquest, it was restoration. Maps changed. Governors were appointed. Administrators followed behind to rebuild government offices, collect taxes, restore order, and reconnect these territories with Constantinople. For a while, it seemed as though Justinian's vision might actually succeed. The empire expanded. Ancient Roman lands once again answered to an emperor in Constantinople. It must have felt as though history itself was moving backward. Yet every success carried new responsibilities. More land meant more roads, more officials, more defenses, more communication, more money. Managing a larger empire became increasingly difficult. Distance alone created endless problems. Messages took weeks to travel. Local governors faced challenges the emperor could not immediately solve. Every new province demanded attention. The larger the empire became, the harder it was to hold together. This was one of history's quiet lessons. Building something is often easier than maintaining it. A garden may bloom beautifully one spring. Keeping it healthy year after year requires constant care. Empires are much the same. By the end of Justinian's reign, Constantinople stood as one of the richest and most impressive cities on earth. Its laws had been strengthened. Its greatest church reached toward the sky. Its influence stretched across the Mediterranean. Yet all these achievements came with lasting costs. Heavy taxes left many people tired. Ambitious projects emptied enormous amounts of treasure. An expanded empire required endless work just to keep it running. Still, Justinian had changed history. He preserved Roman law for future generations. He gave the world one of its greatest buildings. He reminded Europe that the Roman Empire was still alive, still dreaming big, and still capable of astonishing the world. Whether those dreams were sustainable was another question entirely. But for one remarkable reign, Justinian proved that sometimes the biggest dreamers leave behind the biggest footprints, even if someone else has to pay the bill. It is easy to think about great empires through the lives of emperors. History books often introduce us to rulers, generals, and famous leaders, but they rarely stop to ask a much quieter question. What was an ordinary Tuesday like? Not a day filled with celebrations, not a royal ceremony, just a completely normal morning in Constantinople. So tonight let us leave the palace behind. Instead, let us walk through the city as the sun slowly rises over the rooftops. The air is cool. The streets are still damp from the morning dew. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster has decided that everyone should wake up immediately. Whether everyone agrees with him is another matter. As the first light touches the city walls, the bread bakers have already been awake for hours. Their ovens glow with orange fire. The smell of fresh bread drifts into narrow streets, inviting sleepy neighbors to begin another day. Large round loaves are carefully stacked on wooden shelves. Some customers carry only a few small coins. Others buy enough bread to feed large families. The baker knows many of them by name. There is comfort in routine. The same faces, the same greetings, the same promise that tomorrow morning, the bread will be waiting once again. Not far away, the fishermen are returning from the Bosporus. Their small boats gently rock against the docks. Fishing nets are pulled aboard, heavy with silver fish that sparkle in the morning sunlight. The sea has always been generous to Constantinople. It provides food, trade, travel, and endless work. Dock workers help unload the catch while buyers quickly gather to choose the freshest fish. The air smells of salt, seaweed, and fresh water. Seagulls circle overhead with great confidence. They firmly believe every fish belongs to them. The fishermen politely disagree. Walking deeper into the city, you begin hearing another sound. Soft footsteps, quiet voices, the peaceful singing of monks. Monasteries are scattered throughout Constantinople. Behind their walls, life follows a slower rhythm. The monks rise early. They pray. They read. They copy books by hand. Hour after hour, careful hands move across parchment, preserving knowledge that might otherwise disappear forever. Some copy religious writings. Others preserve ancient books about science, history, philosophy, or medicine. They probably never imagined that people living over 1,000 years later would still be grateful for their patience. Copying one book by hand is enough to test anyone's concentration. Imagine discovering halfway through that you accidentally skipped a page. Even monks likely sighed once in a while. Outside again, another group is already busy. Silk merchants. Their shops display fabrics so smooth they almost seem to flow like water. Bright reds, deep blues, golden threads, rich purple cloth once reserved for emperors. Customers gently touch the fabric before discussing prices. Silk has traveled an incredible distance before arriving here. Sometimes crossing deserts, sometimes mountains, sometimes oceans. Every roll of cloth carries its own long story. The merchants know that beauty often sells itself. Still, a little friendly conversation never hurts. Children weave happily through the crowded streets. Some help their parents. Others chase one another through small squares, turning every open space into a playground. Wooden toys appear. Simple balls bounce across stone roads. Laughter echoes between buildings. For children, Constantinople is not the capital of a mighty empire. It is simply home. They know which bakery gives the sweetest treats, which fountain has the coldest water, which neighbor smiles the most. Empires may rise and fall. Childhood remains wonderfully familiar. Nearby, schools begin welcoming students. Teachers gather small groups inside modest classrooms. Lessons begin with reading and writing. Some students learn mathematics. Others study poetry, history, or religious teachings. Education is respected. Parents hope their children will grow wiser than themselves. Of course, not every student enjoys every lesson. There has probably always been one child staring out the window instead of paying attention. Some traditions survive every century. Doctors also moved through the city, carrying knowledge gathered from generations before them. Medicine in the Byzantine world combines careful observation with ancient learning. Doctors examine patients, prepare herbal remedies, treat broken bones, offer advice about healthy living. Some treatments help greatly, others, well, history occasionally reminds us that medical science was still learning. Thankfully, doctors genuinely wished to help, and many became highly respected members of their communities. As the morning grows warmer, people gather around public fountains. These are more than simple places to collect water. Neighbors meet here every day. They exchange news, share stories, discuss family matters. Water splashes gently into stone basins, while conversations flow just as freely. Some people come carrying large clay jars balanced carefully on their shoulders. Others simply stop for a drink before continuing their work. Fresh water is precious. Fortunately, Constantinople has an impressive system to deliver it. Long aqueducts carry water from distant hills into the city. Underground cisterns store enormous reserves beneath the streets. Even during dry seasons, this careful system helps keep life moving. Most people never stop to admire pipes or reservoirs, yet cities depend on such quiet achievements. Without clean water, even the richest empire struggles. Around midday, delicious smells begin filling every neighborhood. Street food vendors become busy. Fresh bread stuffed with cheese, warm meat cooked over open fires, bowls of lentils, olives, nuts, honey cakes, roasted chestnuts. The scent of herbs and spices drifts through the air. Hungry workers pause for quick meals before returning to their jobs. The food is simple, fresh, filling, exactly what people need after a busy morning. If you close your eyes, the city becomes a symphony of ordinary sounds. Blacksmiths hammer glowing metal, horses pull wooden carts across stone roads, church bells ring gently in the distance, merchants call out today's prices, children laugh, dogs bark, birds sing from rooftops, water flows through fountains, ships sound their horns in the harbor. None of these sounds seem especially important on their own. Together, they create the heartbeat of Constantinople. Every neighborhood has its own personality. Near the harbor, streets feel crowded and busy. Sailors, merchants, and travelers fill the roads. Closer to churches and monasteries, life becomes quieter. In wealthier districts, large homes stand behind stone walls with peaceful gardens inside. Elsewhere, ordinary families live in smaller houses built close together. Neighbors know each other well. Doors remain open. People borrow tools, share meals, watch one another's children. Communities grow naturally over generations. As afternoon slowly becomes evening, workers begin returning home. Bakers prepare tomorrow's dough. Fishermen repair torn nets. Teachers finish lessons. Doctors visit one final patient. Merchants carefully count their coins before locking their shops. Families gather around simple evening meals. Candles are lit. Stories are shared. Parents ask children about their day. The city begins slowing once again. Above it all, the massive walls still stand quietly. The harbor remains calm. The Bosporus continues carrying ships between continents. Tomorrow morning, the same routine will begin again. Bread will bake, fish will arrive, children will laugh, teachers will teach, doctors will heal, monks will write, merchants will bargain. Life inside Constantinople does not depend on grand ceremonies or famous emperors. It depends on thousands of ordinary people doing ordinary work. And perhaps that is the real secret behind the greatest city on earth. Not only its mighty walls or magnificent churches, but the countless quiet lives lived within them. One peaceful day after another, for century after century. When people think about powerful empires, they often picture huge armies, rows of soldiers, shining armor, war horses, long marches across distant lands. The Byzantine Empire certainly had soldiers, but one of its greatest strengths did not wear armor. It wore fine silk, and it carried a bag full of gold coins. Sometimes the quiet sound of money changing hands accomplished far more than the loud sound of swords. That may not sound very exciting, but if you ask any merchant who successfully avoided a war, they would probably tell you it was an excellent day. Constantinople became wealthy because it sat in exactly the right place. Imagine standing at the busiest crossroads in the world. Roads from Europe met roads from Asia. Sea routes connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Ships sailed in from every direction. Caravans arrived after crossing deserts and mountains. Nearly everyone passing between east and west found themselves coming through this remarkable city. Every traveler brought something valuable. Sometimes it was spices, sometimes cloth, sometimes precious stones, sometimes ideas, and almost always someone was collecting taxes along the way. The empire understood something very simple. Trade creates wealth. If merchants feel safe, they return. If they return, they spend money. If they spend money, the empire grows richer. Everyone benefits. Well, almost everyone. The tax collectors were already benefiting quite nicely. One of the greatest treasures moving through Constantinople was silk. Today, silk feels ordinary. You might own a silk tie, a scarf, or a pillowcase. But in the ancient world, silk was one of the most valuable materials anyone could own. It was soft, light, strong. It shimmered beautifully in the sunlight. For kings and queens across Europe, wearing silk was a way of saying, "Things are going rather well for me." For centuries, the finest silk came from China. The secret of making it was carefully protected. The process depended on tiny silkworms feeding on mulberry leaves before spinning delicate cocoons. Those cocoons became the thread that would eventually be woven into beautiful cloth. For a long time, very few people outside China understood exactly how this worked. Silk traveled thousands of miles before reaching the Byzantine Empire. By the time it arrived, it had become incredibly expensive. Then, according to one famous story, everything changed. Two monks returned from the east, carrying a remarkable secret. Hidden inside hollow walking sticks, they reportedly brought silkworm eggs back to the empire. Whether every detail of the story is true remains uncertain. History sometimes enjoys adding a little mystery. But what matters is this. Before long, the Byzantines learned how to produce silk themselves. Suddenly, they no longer depended entirely on distant suppliers. Imperial workshops began producing magnificent fabrics. The government kept tight control over this valuable industry. Silk became more than beautiful clothing. It became a symbol of power. Certain colors and designs could only be worn by the emperor or members of the imperial family. Purple silk, in particular, became closely linked with the throne. If you accidentally borrowed the emperor's favorite purple outfit, it would probably not end well. Silk workshops buzzed with activity. Workers carefully unwound delicate threads from cocoons. Weavers guided fine strands across large wooden looms. Artists added colorful patterns using gold thread. Every finished piece represented weeks of careful work. No one hurried. Beautiful things rarely enjoy being rushed. Silk was only one part of the empire's wealth. The other great symbol was gold, specifically Byzantine gold coins. These coins became famous across the known world. Merchants trusted them. Foreign rulers accepted them. Travelers carried them across continents. For centuries, Byzantine gold coins kept their value remarkably well. That consistency mattered. Imagine buying something today with money that everyone believes is reliable. Trade becomes easier. Business grows. Confidence spreads. The empire understood that stable money could be just as important as strong walls. Gold coins traveled farther than many emperors ever did. They appeared in markets from England to India. Archaeologists still discover them, buried far beyond the empire's borders. Each coin tells the same quiet story. People trusted Byzantine trade. Of course, coins do not move by themselves. Someone had to carry them. That someone was usually a merchant. Being a merchant in the Byzantine world required patience. A great deal of patience. Journeys often lasted months. Some lasted more than a year. Caravans crossed dry deserts beneath blazing suns. Mountain passes tested both travelers and animals. Ships battled rough seas and changing winds. Roads became muddy after rain. Bridges sometimes disappeared altogether. And every traveler probably wished for better weather at least once each week. Still, they kept moving, because the rewards were worth it. A merchant might leave India carrying spices. Another departed Arabia with incense. A trader from Persia transported carpets and fine metalwork. Caravans from Central Asia brought horses, furs, and silk. Egyptian ships delivered grain that fed the enormous population of Constantinople. Every road seemed to lead toward the city. When these travelers finally reached Constantinople, the work was only beginning. The ports never seemed to rest. Ships lined the docks from morning until evening. Sailors shouted instructions. Dock workers unloaded heavy crates. Wooden barrels rolled across stone paths. Cranes lifted valuable cargo from ships into waiting warehouses. The smell of salt water mixed with fresh timber, spices, fish, and rope. It was busy, but it was organized. Warehouses stretched along the harbor, storing goods from every corner of the known world. One building might hold grain, another precious silk. Nearby stood barrels of olive oil, wine, dried fruit, honey, and spices. Guards watched carefully. Owners counted every crate. Losing valuable cargo was bad enough. Explaining that loss to an impatient merchant was probably even worse. Before goods entered the markets, customs officials had important work to do. They examined shipments, recorded cargo, collected taxes, issued permissions. Not everyone's favorite people, perhaps, but they played an important role. Without customs officers, the empire would lose enormous amounts of income. Governments have always appreciated organized paperwork, even if merchants occasionally sighed while waiting in line. Once approved, goods flowed into the city's great marketplaces. Here, buyers and sellers met beneath colorful awnings. Languages blended together: Greek, Arabic, Persian, Armenian, Latin. Many conversations involved smiling politely while quietly trying to negotiate a better price. The markets offered almost everything imaginable. Silks shimmered beside spices. Jewelry sparkled beside carved ivory. Glassware reflected sunlight. Perfume filled the air. Fresh fruit stood beside rare books. Every corner promised another discovery. Yet perhaps the empire's greatest skill was not simply selling goods, it was using wealth wisely. Byzantine rulers often preferred diplomacy over fighting. Instead of sending soldiers first, they frequently sent gifts. Gold, silk robes, jewels, titles, trade agreements. A neighboring ruler, treated with respect, might become a friend instead of an enemy. A wealthy ally often proved more useful than a defeated rival. Money opened doors that armies sometimes could not. Trade created friendships. Gifts built trust. Diplomacy bought peace. War was expensive. Peace, surprisingly, could sometimes be the better bargain. That did not mean the empire avoided every conflict. Far from it. But its leaders understood that prosperity depended on stability. Merchants preferred safe roads. Ships preferred peaceful seas. Markets preferred confident buyers. Gold and silk, quietly, became powerful tools of statecraft. In the end, the Byzantine Empire grew rich, not simply because it possessed valuable treasures. It grew rich because it became the place where the treasures of the world met. Its coins inspired trust. Its silk inspired admiration. Its markets welcomed distant travelers. And its rulers learned that sometimes the strongest empire is not the one with the biggest army, but the one where everyone wants to come to do business. If you spent a single day in Constantinople, one thing would quickly become clear. Faith was everywhere. It was not tucked away inside churches, waiting only for special holidays. It was part of everyday life. It greeted people in the morning. It followed them through the afternoon. And it quietly stayed with them as evening settled over the city. For the people of the Byzantine Empire, Christianity was not simply a religion. It was a way of understanding the world. It shaped how people worked, how they celebrated, how they mourned, how they raised children, how they thought about life, and what came after it. To understand the Byzantine Empire, you first have to understand that faith was woven into almost everything people did. Imagine walking through the streets just after sunrise. The city is slowly waking up. Merchants are opening their shops. Bakers are pulling warm bread from their ovens. Fishermen are returning from the Bosporus. Then somewhere nearby, church bells begin to ring. The sound spreads across rooftops like gentle waves. One church answers another. People pause for a moment. Some quietly make the sign of the cross. Others whisper a short prayer before continuing their day. No one seems surprised. This is simply how every morning begins. The skyline itself reminds everyone of their faith. Churches rise above homes and markets. Their domes catch the sunlight. Their towers stand proudly above crowded streets. The greatest of them all is Hagia Sophia. From almost anywhere in the city, its enormous dome can be seen rising above the rooftops. Visitors entering for the first time often stopped in silence. Light poured through dozens of windows. Golden mosaics shimmered high above. Marble columns stretched toward the ceiling. The building felt larger than words could easily describe. People did not simply come here to admire architecture. They came to pray, to celebrate, to seek comfort, to give thanks. For many, stepping inside Hagia Sophia felt like stepping into another world. Even today, centuries later, many visitors still have that same feeling. Churches of every size filled the empire. Some were grand and richly decorated. Others were small village churches with simple stone walls and wooden roofs. But whether large or small, they served the same purpose. They brought communities together. A church was often much more than a place of worship. It was where neighbors met, where families gathered, where children were baptized, where weddings were celebrated, where people said goodbye to loved ones. Life itself seemed to pass through its doors. Away from the busy streets stood the monasteries. These places followed a much slower rhythm. Behind quiet walls, monks lived lives devoted to prayer, study, and work. Their days were carefully organized. They rose before sunrise. They prayed together. They worked in gardens, prepared meals, copied books, studied scripture, then prayed again. To some people today, that routine might sound repetitive. To the monks, it brought peace. The outside world often felt noisy and uncertain. Inside the monastery, every day followed a familiar pattern. There was comfort in that steady rhythm. Many monasteries became places of learning as well. Long before printing presses existed, books had to be copied by hand. Patient scribes spent countless hours writing every letter with care. One mistake might require beginning an entire page again. It demanded incredible concentration, probably a very steady hand, and perhaps a little extra patience before the morning cup of, well, they did not have coffee quite the way many of us know it today. Still, somehow they managed. Thanks to these quiet workers, many ancient books survived through the centuries. History owes them a great deal. Another familiar sight throughout the empire was the icon. Icons were painted images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, saints, and biblical scenes. They were not simply decorations. People treated them with deep respect. Many believed icons helped them focus their prayers and remember the lives of holy figures. Homes often contained small icons. Churches displayed large collections of them. Candles burned before them. Visitors kissed them gently. Some travelers carried small icons wherever they went. They offered comfort during long journeys. They reminded people they were never truly alone. Of course, painting an icon was not considered ordinary artwork. Artists prepared carefully. They followed traditional styles that had been passed down for generations. Every color carried meaning. Every gesture mattered. Creating an icon became an act of devotion as much as an act of painting. Faith also inspired many people to travel. Pilgrimages became an important part of Byzantine life. Some journeys were short, others took weeks or even months. Travelers visited famous churches, monasteries, and holy places. Along the roads, strangers often became companions. Stories were exchanged, meals were shared, prayers offered together. The destination mattered, but so did the journey itself. Walking long distances gave people time to reflect, to slow down, to leave ordinary worries behind for a little while. Considering how busy modern life often feels, perhaps they were onto something. Throughout the year, religious festivals filled the calendar. These were joyful occasions. Churches overflowed with people, candles lit the darkness, choirs filled the air with beautiful singing. Families prepared special meals. Neighbors visited one another. Children eagerly looked forward to celebrations. Markets became busier as people bought food, clothing, and gifts. Even those with very little often found ways to celebrate. Festivals reminded everyone that they belonged to something larger than themselves. Daily prayer remained just as important as these great celebrations. Many people prayed when they woke, before meals, during work, before sleep. Some paused whenever they passed a church. Others prayed quietly, at home. Prayer did not always require long speeches. Sometimes it was only a few simple words, a moment of gratitude, a request for guidance, a hope for peace. These small moments became part of everyday life, as natural as baking bread or drawing water from a fountain. Faith united the empire in many ways. People shared the same festivals, the same prayers, the same stories. Churches connected distant communities across thousands of miles. A traveler visiting another Byzantine city could enter a local church and immediately recognize much of what was happening. There was comfort in that familiarity. Yet, like many parts of human history, religion also brought disagreements. Questions about belief, church leadership, and religious practices sometimes created deep debates. Emperors became involved, bishops argued, councils met to settle difficult questions. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they created entirely new disagreements. One of the most famous disputes centered on icons themselves. Some believed sacred images should remain in churches. Others argued they should be removed. The debate lasted for generations and affected families, churches, artists, and emperors alike. Eventually, the use of icons was restored, but the disagreement showed that even people sharing the same faith could understand it differently. Despite these moments of division, Christianity remained the heart of Byzantine life. It shaped the city's skyline, its calendar, its music, its art, its learning, its laws, and its daily routines. The empire became known not only for its wealth, powerful walls, or busy markets, but also for its deep spiritual life. As the sun slowly set over Constantinople, candles flickered inside churches across the city. Monks quietly sang evening prayers. Families gathered in their homes. The noise of the markets faded. The harbor grew calm, and beneath the great dome of Hagia Sophia, voices rose once more, not in celebration of an emperor or a victory, but in quiet worship that had become the steady heartbeat of an empire for centuries. When people picture a powerful empire, they usually imagine soldiers marching across open fields. They picture shining armor, large banners waving in the wind, trumpets sounding, generals giving dramatic speeches that somehow everyone can hear. History certainly has plenty of those moments. But the Byzantine Empire had another favorite way of solving problems. It involved fewer swords and far more conversations. The Byzantines understood something that many kingdoms learned the hard way. Winning a war is expensive. Preventing a war is often much cheaper. If your enemy decides not to attack in the first place, your farms remain untouched. Your cities stay standing. Your merchants keep trading. Your people sleep peacefully. That is a very good outcome, even if it makes for a less exciting movie. The empire spent centuries surrounded by powerful neighbors. To the east stood mighty kingdoms. To the north came new tribes and wandering peoples. Across the sea were ambitious rulers with dreams of expanding their own lands. There was almost always someone nearby who wanted a little more power, or a little more land, or Perhaps both. The Byzantine rulers understood they could not fight everyone forever. Even the strongest army grows tired. Even the richest treasury eventually becomes lighter. So instead of asking only, "How do we defeat our enemies?" they often asked a different question. How do we avoid making them enemies at all? That simple idea became one of the empire's greatest strengths. Diplomacy was not seen as weakness. It was considered a skill. In fact, it was almost an art form. The imperial court welcomed visitors from every direction. Kings sent ambassadors. Princes delivered letters. Foreign merchants carried messages along with their goods. The palace became one of the busiest meeting places in the known world. Imagine walking into one great hall. On one side stands a traveler from Arabia. Across the room is a visitor from Central Asia. Nearby, an envoy from a European kingdom waits patiently. Everyone has different languages, different clothing, different customs. Yet somehow they all find themselves talking to the same emperor, or at least to one very busy official. Byzantine diplomats became experts at conversation. They listened carefully. They asked questions. They remembered names. They learned who trusted whom, who feared whom, and who secretly disliked their own neighbors. Information, after all, can be just as valuable as gold, sometimes even more valuable. Marriage was another powerful tool. Today, people usually marry because they fall in love. In the medieval world, royal families often had additional responsibilities. A marriage could unite two kingdoms. It could end years of tension. It could create peace between powerful neighbors. A prince might marry a princess from another land. Suddenly, yesterday's rival became today's relative. Family dinners may still have been slightly awkward, but wars sometimes became much less likely. The Byzantines arranged many such alliances. Not every marriage created lasting peace. Human relationships have always been complicated. Still, these royal connections often bought valuable years of stability. Sometimes diplomacy became even more practical. Instead of sending an army, the empire simply sent gifts. Beautiful silk robes, gold coins, fine jewelry, rare books, expensive horses. These were not random acts of generosity. They were carefully chosen investments. A respected ruler receiving generous gifts might decide friendship was more rewarding than conflict. Some people call this generosity. Others might quietly call it excellent business. Then there was the subject everyone politely pretends not to notice: bribery. Yes, the Byzantines occasionally believed that paying someone to stay peaceful was less expensive than paying thousands of soldiers to fight. Imagine a neighboring tribe preparing for trouble. Now imagine their leader receiving gold, valuable gifts, or favorable trade agreements instead. Suddenly, attacking Constantinople becomes a much less attractive idea. From a modern point of view, this may seem unusual, but from the Byzantine point of view, it often made perfect sense. Gold was cheaper than rebuilding burned cities. Money spent on peace could save far greater costs later. Sometimes the most effective battle was the one that never happened. Of course, successful diplomacy required good information. You cannot solve problems if you do not understand them. The Byzantine government became remarkably skilled at gathering news. Travelers shared stories. Merchants reported changes along trade routes. Ambassadors observed foreign courts. Letters crossed enormous distances. Officials carefully collected small pieces of information until a much larger picture began to appear. The empire wanted to know who was becoming stronger, who was becoming weaker, which kingdoms had good harvests, which rulers were growing old, which princes might soon inherit a throne. Even small details could matter. History often turns on information that seems unimportant at first. Alongside this network came another familiar part of politics: spies. Now, if you are imagining mysterious figures dressed entirely in black, quietly hiding behind curtains, history is usually a little less dramatic. Many spies looked perfectly ordinary. Some traveled as merchants, others appeared as servants, some simply listened carefully during conversations. Their greatest weapon was not a sword. It was attention. They watched, they remembered. Then they quietly reported what they had learned. The Byzantine Empire valued knowledge because knowledge created options. If danger could be spotted early, peaceful solutions often became possible. Negotiation was perhaps the empire's greatest talent. Byzantine officials were famous for their patience. Meetings sometimes lasted for days. Letters traveled back and forth for months. Every word mattered. Every promise was considered carefully. Every agreement was examined from several different angles. To outsiders, this process probably seemed slow, very slow, almost painfully slow. But rushing important decisions rarely produces good results. The Byzantines preferred careful thinking. Imagine two rulers arguing over a border. One solution is to gather armies. Another is to gather maps. The Byzantines usually reached for the maps first. If a disagreement could be solved through discussion, everyone benefited. Fields remained peaceful. Trade continued. Families stayed safe. The empire earned a reputation for careful negotiation because it understood something simple. Peace creates prosperity. War interrupts it. That does not mean the Byzantines avoided every conflict. Far from it. There were times when fighting became unavoidable, but even then, diplomacy rarely disappeared. Negotiations often continued before battles, during battles, sometimes even immediately afterward. The goal was never endless war. The goal was lasting stability. Perhaps the empire's most remarkable quality was patience. Modern life often encourages quick decisions, instant answers, immediate results. The Byzantines thought differently. If solving a problem required months of discussion, they accepted that. If waiting one extra year prevented a costly war, they considered the wait worthwhile. Patience became a political strategy. Sometimes they allowed rivals to exhaust themselves. Sometimes they watched neighboring kingdoms argue with one another instead of becoming involved. Sometimes doing almost nothing turned out to be the smartest decision of all. That required confidence. It also required discipline. Not every challenge demanded an immediate response. By the time many neighboring kingdoms had risen and disappeared, the Byzantine Empire remained. Not because it always fought the hardest, but because it often chose carefully when not to fight at all. Its greatest victories were not always celebrated with parades. Many were almost invisible. A peaceful border, a successful treaty, a marriage alliance, a well-timed gift, a letter delivered at exactly the right moment. These quiet successes rarely became legends, yet together, they helped keep the empire alive for centuries.
And perhaps that was the Byzantines' greatest secret of all. They understood that while armies can win battles, patience, careful words, and a little well-placed gold can sometimes win something even more valuable: peace.
If you look at a map of the Byzantine Empire at its greatest size, it is easy to think it would last forever. The cities are busy, the markets are full, the churches shine with gold mosaics. The walls of Constantinople seem impossible to break. Everything appears strong, everything appears stable, but history has a quiet habit. It rarely asks for permission before it begins to change, and it almost never changes everything in a single day. Empires usually do not collapse like a tower of blocks knocked over by one careless hand. They wear down slowly, like a pair of favorite shoes, one small crack, then another, a loose stitch, a worn sole. You barely notice the changes at first. Then one day you realize they are not quite as strong as they used to be. The Byzantine Empire faced that kind of slow change. Not one great disaster, but hundreds of smaller ones. Each generation solved some problems. Each generation also inherited new ones. The first challenge often came from something nobody could control. Disease. Today, if someone feels unwell, they might visit a doctor or a hospital. In the medieval world, sickness was far more frightening. People did not understand germs. They knew illness spread, but they did not know exactly why. Sometimes an ordinary morning could become a week of worry. Families cared for one another as best they could. Neighbors offered help. Churches filled with prayers. Yet, many diseases ignored even the kindest efforts. One of the greatest disasters arrived during the reign of Emperor Justinian. A terrible plague spread across the empire. It reached Constantinople by sea, traveling quietly aboard merchant ships. The ships looked perfectly ordinary. The danger hiding inside them did not. Soon the city was overwhelmed. Homes became silent. Markets grew quieter. Work slowed. Many skilled workers never returned to their trades. Farmers disappeared from their fields. Builders left unfinished projects behind. Families mourned loved ones. The empire survived, but it never completely escaped the effects. When fewer people remain, everything becomes harder. There are fewer hands to grow food, fewer workers to repair roads, fewer merchants to fill the markets. Recovery takes years, sometimes generations. Even after the plague faded, its shadow remained. Then there was the simple question of food. An empire depends on full harvests. Good weather matters. Rain arrives at the right time. Fields produce grain. Villages celebrate. Everyone sleeps a little easier. Unfortunately, nature does not always cooperate. Some years brought drought. Others brought floods. Cold weather damaged crops. Insects sometimes arrived uninvited and helped themselves to the harvest. They were very enthusiastic guests. Farmers, less so. A poor harvest in one village was unfortunate. Several poor harvests across many regions became a serious problem. Food became more expensive. Families had to stretch supplies. Officials searched for grain from distant provinces. Merchants suddenly found themselves carrying even more important cargo. The empire usually found ways to manage, but every difficult season left small scars behind. Nature presented another challenge. Earthquakes. Constantinople stood in a beautiful location. It also stood in a region where the earth occasionally reminded everyone that it was still very much alive. Without warning, the ground could begin to shake. Walls cracked, roofs collapsed, churches suffered damage, homes needed repairs. Even mighty buildings were not completely safe. The great dome of Hagia Sophia itself required rebuilding after earthquake damage more than once. Imagine spending years creating one of the world's greatest buildings, only for the ground to suddenly decide it preferred a different design. Fortunately, Byzantine builders became remarkably skilled at repairing and strengthening important structures. Still, repairs cost money, time, labor, resources that could no longer be used elsewhere. Even when no earthquake struck, another challenge quietly waited inside the palace. Politics. Every empire needs good leadership. Sometimes the Byzantine Empire had excellent emperors. Sometimes, history politely suggests that not every emperor belonged in the job. Succession was rarely simple. A powerful ruler might govern successfully for decades. Then, after his death, uncertainty followed. Who should become emperor? Would the army support the new ruler? Would powerful officials agree? Would ambitious relatives suddenly discover they had always wanted the throne? The answer was occasionally yes. Political disagreements created uncertainty. Plans were delayed. Policies changed. Officials competed for influence. Ordinary people simply hoped someone would keep the government running smoothly. Because while historians often enjoy dramatic palace stories, farmers mostly cared about whether taxes remained reasonable and roads stayed open. Leadership mattered because stability mattered. Beyond the borders, the world never stood still either. Neighboring empires changed constantly. Old rivals disappeared. New ones arrived. Some sought friendship. Others preferred competition. Every generation introduced new neighbors with new ambitions. The Byzantines could never assume today's peaceful border would remain peaceful forever. Diplomats stayed busy. Messengers traveled endlessly. Treaties required constant attention. Managing relationships became almost a full-time occupation. Trade also began changing. For centuries, Constantinople had stood at the center of global commerce. Its location brought enormous wealth. But trade routes are like rivers. Sometimes they change course. New roads appeared. Different ports became important. New kingdoms controlled key regions. Merchants naturally looked for the safest and cheapest ways to move their goods. If another route offered better opportunities, many traders happily took it. Business has always been practical. The empire noticed these gradual shifts. Fewer ships in one harbor, more caravans choosing another road. A small change this year, another next year. No single moment seemed dramatic. Yet together they slowly affected the empire's income. Less trade meant fewer taxes. Fewer taxes meant more difficult choices. Should the government repair roads, strengthen walls, support churches, pay soldiers? Every decision became a little harder. None of these problems alone destroyed the Byzantine Empire. That is the important part. One plague did not end it. One failed harvest did not end it. One earthquake did not end it. One political argument did not end it. One changing trade route did not end it. The empire always recovered, again and again and again. That resilience became one of its greatest strengths. But resilience also has limits. Imagine carrying one small stone in your pocket. It feels light. Add another, then another. Eventually, your pockets become surprisingly heavy. Each stone is tiny. Together, they become difficult to carry. The Byzantine Empire experienced something similar. Every generation inherited all the unfinished work of the one before. Repair this bridge, rebuild that church, restore this harvest, negotiate with those neighbors, balance the treasury, strengthen the walls, train new officials, solve another crisis. The work never truly ended. Children grew into adults. Adults became grandparents. New emperors wore the crown. Old challenges quietly waited for them. The empire continued because people kept adapting. Builders rebuilt after earthquakes. Farmers planted again after poor harvests. Merchants found new opportunities. Doctors cared for the sick. Monks copied books. Teachers educated children. Life moved forward, perhaps a little more carefully than before. History often remembers dramatic endings. The Byzantine Empire teaches a different lesson. Great civilizations usually do not disappear because of one terrible day. They change because of thousands of ordinary days, 1,000 small challenges, 1,000 careful decisions, 1,000 quiet struggles, each one manageable on its own. Yet together, over many centuries, they slowly made carrying the weight of an empire just a little more difficult than it had been for the generation before. If you could visit Constantinople in the early years of the empire and then return several hundred years later, you would notice something interesting. The city would still feel familiar. The great walls would still stand. Church bells would still echo through the streets. Merchants would still crowd the markets. Ships would still glide across the Bosporus. But if you listened carefully, something important would have changed. The language around you. The voices in the streets would sound different. Shopkeepers would greet customers in Greek. Teachers would explain lessons in Greek. Children would play games while laughing in Greek. Even many government officials would speak Greek without thinking twice. Yet if you ask these same people a simple question, "Who are you?" they would probably answer with confidence, "We are Romans." At first that might sound confusing. How can someone speak Greek, live in what is now modern-day Turkey, and still proudly call themselves Roman? The answer takes us into one of the most fascinating changes in history. Because identities do not always change as quickly as maps do. The Roman Empire had always been a mixture of many different cultures. Even during its earliest centuries, people spoke dozens of languages. Latin became the language of government and the army in much of the empire. Official documents were written in Latin. Military commands were given in Latin. Many laws were recorded in Latin. It became the language of power. But the eastern half of the empire had a different story. Long before the Romans arrived, Greek culture had already spread across these lands. Centuries earlier, the campaigns of Alexander the Great had carried the Greek language far into the eastern Mediterranean and beyond. By the time Constantinople became the imperial capital, Greek was already deeply rooted in everyday life. People bought bread in Greek. They argued with neighbors in Greek. They told bedtime stories in Greek, and if someone accidentally stepped on their foot in a crowded market, they probably complained in Greek too. Everyday life rarely waits for official paperwork. Over time, this became impossible to ignore. While Latin remained important in government for many years, Greek slowly became more practical, more useful, more familiar. Emperors realized that if most of their people already spoke Greek, perhaps the government should do the same. This was not a dramatic announcement. No one gathered in the city square and declared, "Starting tomorrow, everyone please switch languages." History usually moves more quietly than that. Instead, generation after generation, Greek became more common in official life. By the 7th century, it had become the main language of government. Imperial laws appeared in Greek. Court officials worked in Greek. Letters crossed the empire written in Greek. Latin had not disappeared completely. Its influence remained, but its place at the center of everyday government had slowly faded. This change was not a sign that the empire had stopped being Roman. It was simply adapting to the people who lived inside it. The empire understood something very practical. Communication works best when people actually understand one another. Language was only one part of the transformation. Roman traditions also began to change. Some customs stayed exactly as they had for centuries. Others slowly evolved. The clothing people wore became different from that of ancient Rome. Long flowing robes became common among officials. Court ceremonies grew more formal. Visitors arriving at the imperial palace often found themselves surrounded by elaborate rituals. Everything seemed carefully planned. Where to stand, when to bow, how to greet the emperor. Even silence appeared to have its own set of rules. To outsiders, the palace sometimes felt mysterious, perhaps even a little overwhelming. One wrong step, and you might suddenly wonder if you had accidentally broken a rule nobody remembered to explain. Religion also shaped the empire's identity in new ways. Ancient Rome had once worshipped many gods. Temples filled its cities. Festivals honored different deities throughout the year. But by the Byzantine period, Christianity had become the heart of the empire. Churches replaced many older temples. Christian holidays shaped the calendar. Monasteries became centers of learning. Faith influenced everything from art to law. This spiritual transformation quietly separated the medieval Roman Empire from its ancient past. Art changed as well. Walk into an early Roman building, and you might see realistic statues celebrating emperors or military victories. Walk into a Byzantine church centuries later, and you would find glowing mosaics, golden backgrounds, and peaceful images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints. Artists focused less on making people look exactly realistic. Instead, they wanted to express spiritual meaning. Their goal was not simply to paint what the eye could see. It was to help people think about heaven. Even music changed. Churches filled with beautiful chants. Voices echoed beneath great domes without instruments. The sound drifted through stone halls in a slow, peaceful rhythm. Many visitors described the experience as unforgettable. It must have been especially moving inside Hagia Sophia, where every note seemed to float upward into the enormous dome. Meanwhile, daily customs continued evolving. Meals reflected influences from both Europe and Asia. Trade introduced new foods. New fabrics appeared. Different styles of architecture spread across the empire. Travelers brought fresh ideas wherever they went. Constantinople became a place where cultures mixed naturally. It remained Roman, but it was also something uniquely its own. This is why modern historians eventually faced a small problem. If they kept calling this medieval empire simply the Roman Empire, readers might confuse it with the much older empire centered in the city of Rome. To make things clearer, historians later chose a different name, the Byzantine Empire. The word comes from Byzantium, the ancient Greek city that had stood on the site before Constantine rebuilt it as Constantinople. It is a useful label, but it is also a modern invention. The people living there never used it. If you could somehow travel back in time and introduce yourself by saying, "I have come to visit the Byzantine Empire," people might look at you with polite confusion. Then they would probably answer something like, "You mean the Roman Empire," because that is exactly what they believed they were. Their emperor carried the Roman title. Their laws came from Roman traditions. Their history stretched back to ancient Rome. Their identity remained Roman from beginning to end. The name Byzantine helps us organize history. It helps modern readers separate different periods of the Roman story. But it should never make us forget how the people saw themselves. For over 1,000 years, they believed they were continuing the Roman world, not replacing it. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson hidden inside their story. Cultures change, languages change, clothing changes, art changes, customs change, even entire civilizations slowly transform. Yet people often carry their identity with them through all those changes. The Byzantine Empire became more Greek in language, more Christian in spirit, and more Eastern in culture. But in the hearts of its people, one thing never changed. As far as they were concerned, Rome had never truly disappeared. It had simply grown into something new, while still remembering where it had come from. For all its greatness, Constantinople was only one city. A remarkable city, yes, the largest, the richest, the busiest. But the Byzantine Empire stretched far beyond its famous walls. Most people did not live beneath the great dome of Hagia Sophia. Most never walked through the Grand Palace. Most never watched ships fill the Golden Horn every morning. Instead, they lived quieter lives. Lives shaped by the seasons rather than the emperor. Lives measured by sunrise and sunset instead of palace schedules. So tonight let us leave the crowded streets of Constantinople behind. The city slowly disappears in the distance. Its towers become smaller. The sound of church bells fades. The roads become quieter. Ahead lies the countryside. This is another side of the empire, one that history books sometimes forget. As the road stretches eastward, fields begin to replace stone buildings. Farmers are already awake. They usually rise long before the sun fully appears. The morning air is cool. Birds sing from nearby trees. A wooden cart rolls slowly across a dirt road, pulled by a patient donkey that has accepted its daily responsibilities with quiet dignity. The farmer carries simple tools, nothing fancy, no machines, just strong hands and years of experience. Life here depends on the land. Every season matters. Spring brings planting. Summer demands long days beneath the sun. Autumn rewards careful work with harvests. Winter offers a chance to repair tools, mend clothing, and prepare for another year. The rhythm rarely changes. Children help their parents in the fields. They learn by watching how to plant seeds, how to care for animals, how to know when olives are ready to pick. School exists in many places, but the countryside has another classroom. Nature. Its lessons arrive every single day, leaving the open fields behind. The road begins climbing gentle hills. Soon the landscape changes again. Olive groves spread across the countryside. Twisting trees stand quietly beneath the warm Mediterranean sun. Some are already old, very old, perhaps older than anyone living nearby. Their thick trunks tell stories without speaking. Families gather beneath their branches during harvest season. Hands carefully pick olives from the trees. Baskets slowly fill. Later, the olives will become one of the empire's most valuable products. Olive oil lights lamps, flavors meals, supports trade. It quietly touches almost every part of daily life. The work is slow. There is no need to hurry. The trees have waited all year. They are not about to rush now. As the hills become steeper, small mountain villages appear. Stone houses cling to the slopes. Thin trails connect one home to another. Smoke rises gently from chimneys. The air feels cooler here. Life moves at a peaceful pace. Everyone knows everyone else. Neighbors greet each other by name. Children run freely between homes. If a roof needs repairing, Several families often arrive to help. If someone becomes sick, meals appear at the door without needing to be requested. Small communities survive because people depend on one another. There is comfort in that closeness. Of course, there is also very little privacy. If you accidentally trip over your own bucket, chances are half the village will hear about it before dinner. Some things are timeless. Not far from these villages, monasteries stand quietly among forests or high on rocky hills. Many are built in places where the outside world feels wonderfully distant. The monks choose these peaceful locations on purpose. They seek silence, reflection, prayer. Visitors arriving after long journeys often notice the same thing. Everything feels slower. No shouting, no busy marketplaces, only birdsong, flowing water, wind moving gently through the trees. The monks follow familiar routines. Morning prayer, simple meals, gardening, copying books, caring for travelers. Some monasteries welcome pilgrims who need a place to rest. Others offer food to anyone who arrives hungry. Hospitality becomes another quiet form of worship. The roads connecting these villages and monasteries are never completely empty. Travelers pass by throughout the year. Some ride horses, others lead donkeys loaded with supplies. Many simply walk. Roads are the empire's lifelines. Not every road is wide or smooth. Some become muddy after rain. Others climb steep mountain paths. Bridges cross rivers where they can. Elsewhere, travelers simply hope the water is not too deep. A long journey requires patience. Fortunately, people during this time seem to have plenty of it. After walking for many hours, a welcome sight appears, a caravan stop. These resting places are scattered along important trade routes. Here, merchants unpack their goods, animals drink fresh water, travelers enjoy warm meals. Stories travel almost as quickly as merchandise. One table discusses weather, another debates politics. Someone shares news from Constantinople. Someone else describes distant cities across the sea. Different languages mix together beneath the same roof. By morning, everyone continues in different directions. The road never stays empty for long. Many caravans carry remarkable cargo. Silk from the East, spices from Arabia, glassware from Byzantine workshops, wine, olive oil, honey, wool, books copied by patient monks. Every item has its own destination. Every merchant hopes for safe roads and honest customers. Not every part of the countryside feels peaceful. Occasionally, the road climbs toward a lonely castle, standing high above the surrounding hills. These remote fortresses watch over important valleys and mountain passes. Their walls are smaller than Constantinople's mighty defenses, yet they serve an important purpose. They protect nearby villages, watch the roads, provide shelter during uncertain times. Soldiers stationed there live simple lives. Long hours of watching, training, repairing equipment, looking toward distant horizons where very little happens most days. Sometimes the greatest skill of a guard is staying awake during a very quiet afternoon. Life outside the capital is rarely dramatic, and perhaps that is exactly the point. Most people are not trying to change history. They simply hope for good weather. Healthy children, strong harvests, fair prices, peaceful neighbors. The emperor feels very far away. His decisions matter. But daily life depends much more on rain than royal ceremonies. The seasons become the true rulers of the countryside. Spring fills rivers with fresh water. Summer ripens grain. Autumn colors the hills with golden red. Winter brings snow to mountain villages and quiet evenings around warm fires. Families gather together. Grandparents tell old stories. Children listen with wide eyes. Tomorrow the work will begin again. And so the years quietly pass, generation after generation. While Constantinople shines as the jewel of the empire, these villages quietly keep the empire alive. Farmers grow food, fishermen fill markets, olive growers produce oil, monks preserve knowledge, merchants connect distant lands, road builders repair paths, castle guards watch the hills. Each person performs a small task. Together they support something much larger. History often remembers great capitals because they leave behind magnificent buildings. But empires are not held together by cities alone. They survive because countless ordinary people wake before sunrise, work honestly throughout the day, and return home each evening, hoping tomorrow will look much like today. Beyond the famous walls of Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire breathed more slowly. Its heartbeat was quieter, its pace gentler, and in that peaceful rhythm, far from the grand palace and crowded markets, the true foundation of the empire continued its steady work, one ordinary day at a time. For many centuries, Constantinople had faced danger from every direction. Enemies had gathered outside its mighty walls. Kings had dreamed of capturing it. Generals had studied maps, searching for weak points. Again and again, the city had endured. Its walls stood firm, its people rebuilt, its markets reopened, life continued. The greatest surprise in its long history was not that enemies came, it was who they were. Sometimes history takes a turn that no one expects. Imagine spending years strengthening your front door because you are worried about strangers. Then one afternoon, your neighbors accidentally walk in and rearrange the furniture. That is not a perfect comparison, but it gives a small idea of how unexpected the events of the Fourth Crusade felt. The Crusades had begun with a different purpose. Western Christian armies traveled east with the goal of reaching the Holy Land. Many Byzantines believed these travelers were allies, perhaps not always easy allies, perhaps not always predictable, but fellow Christians all the same. They shared many beliefs. They worshipped the same God, even if they sometimes disagreed about church traditions and leadership. No one imagined that one day these travelers would set their eyes on Constantinople itself. Yet history often follows paths that no careful planner could predict. The Fourth Crusade began with good intentions, at least on paper, but plans became complicated. Money became a problem. Debts had to be paid. Political promises pulled the expedition in unexpected directions. One decision led to another, then another. Slowly, almost quietly, the destination changed. Instead of sailing directly toward the Holy Land, the crusading army found itself standing before the walls of Constantinople. It was a sight few people could have imagined. The city had welcomed pilgrims from the west for generations. Now ships filled the harbor carrying armed visitors instead. The people inside the city must have watched with confusion. Surely there had been some mistake. Surely friends would not attack friends. Unfortunately, history does not always reward optimism. The relationship between the Byzantine Empire and Western Europe had already become strained over many years. Differences had slowly grown. Churches in the East and West no longer agreed on every matter. Political interests often pulled rulers in different directions. Misunderstandings accumulated little by little. None of these disagreements alone guaranteed disaster. But together, they created distance. It is much like a friendship that slowly weakens over time. No single argument ends it. Instead, many small misunderstandings quietly build, until one day the relationship feels completely different. When the Crusaders entered Constantinople in the year 1204, the city experienced one of the darkest moments in its long history. This was not simply another change of rulers. Something much deeper had been lost. For generations, Constantinople had gathered treasures from across the ancient world. Beautiful churches, precious books, works of art, ancient statues, rare manuscripts copied carefully by patient hands. Every generation had added something to the city's remarkable collection. Now much of it disappeared. Some treasures were taken west, others were damaged, some vanished forever. Imagine spending centuries filling a great library, each generation carefully placing another book upon the shelves. Then one difficult season leaves those shelves nearly empty. The loss is not measured only by objects, it is measured by memory. The libraries suffered greatly. Many precious manuscripts disappeared. Books that had survived earthquakes, wars, fires, and centuries of careful preservation suddenly faced a different kind of danger. Some were carried away, others were scattered, some simply disappeared into history. Every missing book represented knowledge that might never return. Fortunately, not everything was lost. Many works survived because earlier generations of monks and scholars had copied them again and again. Even so, the losses were deeply felt. Churches that had once echoed with peaceful prayers became strangely quiet. Some stood abandoned, others lost their beautiful decorations. Candles no longer burned where they once had. The familiar rhythm of worship was interrupted. The silence must have felt almost as heavy as the empty buildings themselves. Imagine entering a place that had always been full of music, then finding only stillness. It is a different kind of sadness, not loud, not dramatic, just deeply quiet. The streets also changed. Markets that once welcomed merchants from every direction became less crowded. Some shops remained closed. Families who had lived in the city for generations faced uncertain futures. Neighbors disappeared. Businesses struggled. The lively conversations that had filled busy squares became fewer. Even the great harbor seemed different. Ships still arrived, but the city no longer carried the same confidence it once had. Travelers noticed the change. So did merchants. So did everyone who remembered Constantinople before these events. Perhaps the greatest loss was something impossible to touch: trust. For centuries, the Byzantine Empire had looked toward Western Christian kingdoms as fellow believers. There had been disagreements, certainly, but there had also been cooperation. The Fourth Crusade changed that relationship forever. After 1204, suspicion became much harder to erase. Old friendships became more complicated. Old assumptions no longer felt safe. Trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild. That lesson belongs to every century. The city itself eventually returned to Byzantine control. Years later, Byzantine rulers once again entered Constantinople. The empire had come home. Yet returning home is not the same as finding everything exactly as you left it. The buildings still stood. Many churches reopened. Government returned. Life slowly resumed, but the empire was weaker. Its treasury held less wealth. Its population had declined. Its influence had faded. Recovering from such a shock required enormous effort, and even then, complete recovery never truly came. Trade also suffered. Merchants naturally looked for stable places to do business. Uncertainty frightened investors just as much 800 years ago as it does today. Some trading routes shifted elsewhere. Some foreign merchants built stronger connections with other ports. Economic strength, once interrupted, proved difficult to restore. Meanwhile, neighboring powers continued growing stronger. The Byzantine Empire now faced these changing times with fewer resources than before. Its famous resilience remained. Its people continued rebuilding. Its churches welcomed worshippers again. Its markets reopened. Children still played in narrow streets. Teachers still taught students. Monks still copied books. Life did not stop. It simply became harder. Historians often describe the Fourth Crusade as the moment the Byzantine Empire began its long, final decline. Not because everything ended immediately. Far from it. The empire continued for almost 250 more years. But something important had changed. Imagine an old oak tree standing proudly through countless storms. Then one winter, its strongest branch breaks. The tree survives. Leaves return every spring. Birds still nest among its branches. Yet it is never quite as strong as before. That is what happened to Constantinople. The city remained beautiful. The empire remained alive. Its people remained determined. But one deep wound never fully healed. As evening settled over Constantinople once again, church bells slowly returned to the skyline. Candles flickered behind familiar walls. Merchants reopened their shops. Families rebuilt their homes. Life, as it so often does, continued. Yet beneath the ordinary sounds of another peaceful evening lingered a quiet memory that sometimes the deepest scars are not left by strangers, but by those you once believed would always stand beside you. If someone had visited the Byzantine Empire during its greatest years, they might have believed it would last forever. The capital was magnificent. The markets overflowed with goods. The churches sparkled with gold. Merchants arrived from every corner of the known world. The emperor ruled lands, stretching across seas and mountains. It felt permanent. But history has a gentle way of reminding us that very few things truly are. The end of the Byzantine Empire did not arrive like a lightning strike. It arrived more like the setting sun, slowly, quietly, almost beautifully. The sky does not become dark all at once. It fades little by little. That is why historians often describe these final centuries as a long twilight. The empire did not suddenly disappear after the Fourth Crusade. It survived, it adapted, it continued. But each generation noticed that the world looked slightly different than it had before. The maps became smaller. Territories that had once answered to Constantinople now belonged to other rulers. Cities that had proudly flown the imperial banner gradually became part of neighboring kingdoms. Old borders faded. New ones appeared. To someone studying maps centuries later, these changes seem obvious. To the people living through them, they happened slowly. One province was lost. Years passed. Another region slipped away. Life continued. No one woke up thinking, "Today our empire has become much smaller." Instead, every generation simply accepted the world they had inherited. The population also changed. There were fewer people than before. Wars, disease, migration, and economic hardship all played their part. Some villages became quieter. Some neighborhoods within Constantinople never regained the crowds they once had. Empty houses appeared here and there. Gardens quietly grew where busy streets had once been. Nature has a patient habit of reclaiming places people leave behind. Grass does not hurry. Neither do climbing vines, they simply wait. Wealth slowly faded as well. There were still merchants, there was still trade, but nothing like the bustling commercial empire of earlier centuries. The great streams of gold that had once flowed through Constantinople became smaller. Markets remained open, but fewer luxury goods filled the stalls. Silk could still be found. So could spices. But they arrived less often. Fewer ships entered the harbor. Some old warehouses stood only partly filled. Merchants adjusted. They always do. Business became smaller, not impossible. Even in difficult times, people still needed bread. They still needed shoes. They still needed oil for their lamps. Ordinary life continued because ordinary life always finds a way. Walk through Constantinople during these later centuries, and you would still hear familiar sounds. A baker opening his oven, a blacksmith striking metal, a mother calling her children home before sunset, a fisherman returning with the day's catch. These simple moments had survived plagues, earthquakes, political struggles, and changing borders. They survived now as well. The empire had grown quieter, but it was still alive. The churches remained at the heart of daily life. Their bells continued to ring. Candles still flickered beneath painted icons. Priests welcomed worshippers each morning. Choirs filled great halls with slow, beautiful chants. The buildings themselves had witnessed generations come and go. They had seen emperors crowned, babies baptized, couples married, families gather in grief and in joy. Even as the empire became smaller, faith remained steady. Perhaps it even became more important. When the future feels uncertain, familiar traditions often become a source of comfort. Children, meanwhile, continued doing what children have always done. They laughed. They played games in narrow streets. They chased one another through small courtyards. They asked endless questions that left their parents searching for patient answers. Schools still welcomed students. Teachers still copied lessons onto parchment. Children learned to read. They practiced writing. They studied scripture, history, and language. Some dreamed of becoming scholars. Others hoped to become merchants. Many probably hoped lessons would end a little earlier. Students, thankfully, have remained wonderfully predictable throughout history. Families celebrated holidays, just as they always had. Religious festivals filled churches with music and light. Homes welcomed relatives from nearby villages. Simple meals became special feasts: fresh bread, olives, fish, wine, honey cakes. Children waited eagerly for celebrations. Grandparents told familiar stories once again. The empire's borders had changed, but family traditions remained remarkably strong. That quiet continuity mattered. It reminded people that life was larger than politics. The emperor might change. Borders might shift. But birthdays still arrived. Harvest festivals still came each autumn. Christmas still filled homes with candles and prayers. The ordinary calendar of life continued turning. Outside the capital, the countryside moved with its usual rhythm. Farmers planted crops. Olive trees produced fruit. Shepherds guided flocks across grassy hills. Monasteries remained peaceful places of prayer and learning. Travelers still stopped at roadside inns after long journeys. The roads were less crowded than before, yet they were never empty. The empire had become smaller, but it had not become silent. Even the government continued its work. Officials collected taxes, messengers carried letters, judges settled disputes. The emperor still held court. Diplomats still negotiated with neighboring powers. Running an empire, even a smaller one, required endless organization. Paperwork, it seems, survives almost everything. The Byzantine government never entirely lost its remarkable ability to function. It simply had fewer resources than before. One challenge followed another. Money was scarce. Defending distant frontiers became harder. Neighboring kingdoms grew stronger. The empire often relied on diplomacy more than military strength. Careful negotiations became even more valuable. Sometimes a well-written letter accomplished more than 1,000 soldiers. It was a quieter form of survival, one based on patience rather than power. Travelers visiting Constantinople during these later years sometimes noticed something unusual. The city still inspired admiration. Its great walls remained impressive. Hagia Sophia still dominated the skyline. Its markets still offered goods from distant lands. Yet there was also a feeling of faded greatness, like visiting an old palace whose beauty remains, even though some rooms are no longer used. Nothing is ruined, nothing is forgotten, but time has gently settled over everything. The city seemed to remember its glorious past while quietly accepting its smaller present. And perhaps that is the best way to understand these centuries. The Byzantine Empire did not spend its final years in constant disaster. Most days were ordinary. People woke before sunrise. They baked bread, opened shops, prayed in churches, worked in fields, raised children, shared meals, listened to stories, watched the seasons change. History often focuses on dramatic moments because they are easier to remember. But ordinary days make up almost every human life. The empire's final centuries were filled with ordinary days, thousands of them, each one adding another page to a story that was slowly approaching its final chapter. As the sun set over Constantinople each evening, its golden light reflected from church domes and calm waters, just as it always had. The empire no longer ruled half the known world. Its treasury was no longer overflowing. Its armies were no longer feared as they once were. Yet candles still glowed in family homes. Church bells still echoed across the city. Children still laughed in quiet streets. Life continued, not with the confidence of youth, but with the quiet dignity of old age. And in that long, peaceful twilight, the Byzantine Empire showed one final kind of strength. Not the strength to conquer, but the strength to endure. Every city has mornings that seem completely ordinary. A baker lights his oven, a fisherman checks his nets, children rub the sleep from their eyes. The sun climbs slowly into the sky, as if nothing important could possibly happen. Constantinople had experienced thousands upon thousands of mornings like this. For more than 11 centuries, people had watched the sunrise over the Bosporus. Empires had risen, empires had vanished, yet the city remained. Its walls still stood, its churches still welcomed worshippers, its harbor still welcomed ships from distant lands. Life always seemed to find another tomorrow, but eventually, every long story reaches its final chapter. The spring of 1453 arrived with both hope and quiet worry. The people of Constantinople had lived through difficult years before. They had seen sieges, they had survived disasters. Their city had endured challenges that would have destroyed many others. Perhaps this one would pass as well. Perhaps the mighty walls would once again protect them. Perhaps tomorrow would look very much like yesterday. Hope has always been a faithful companion during uncertain times. As dawn slowly colored the eastern sky, the city began another day. The streets were calm. The air carried the fresh scent of the sea. A few early birds flew over the rooftops, completely unaware that historians would one day remember this season forever. In homes across the city, families quietly woke. Parents prepared simple breakfasts. Children stretched and yawned. Some complained about getting out of bed. That tradition appears to have survived every century. Life still followed familiar routines. Even when the future felt uncertain, people still needed to eat. They still needed water. They still needed to begin another day. Not far away, the monks had already risen. Inside peaceful monasteries, candles flickered softly. Morning prayers echoed beneath ancient stone ceilings. Voices blended together in slow, gentle chants that had been sung by generations before them. The words were familiar, the melodies comforting. Outside the monastery walls, the world seemed increasingly uncertain. Inside, time appeared to move differently. Prayer gave people something steady to hold on to, something that could not easily be shaken. Across the city, churches slowly filled with worshippers. Some came to ask for strength. Others came to find peace. Many simply wished to begin the day with quiet reflection. No one knew exactly what the coming weeks would bring. But faith remained one constant in a changing world. Meanwhile, the harbor was already awake. Ships rested gently upon calm water. Fishermen prepared their boats as they always had. Ropes creaked, wooden docks groaned softly beneath busy footsteps. A few merchants looked toward the sea, wondering what news might arrive next. Trade had slowed greatly during the siege. Still, the harbor remained the city's connection to the outside world. Every ship carried possibility. Every sail on the horizon inspired questions. Would help arrive? Would supplies last? Would another day pass peacefully? The harbor had witnessed centuries of arrivals and departures. This morning felt different, yet it still looked remarkably beautiful beneath the rising sun. In the markets, merchants carefully arranged their goods. Fresh bread rested upon wooden tables. Olives filled woven baskets. Cloth merchants unfolded colorful fabrics. Even in uncertain times, shops opened. Business continued. People still needed food. Families still needed clothing. Children still hoped for sweet treats whenever possible. The market may have been quieter than it once was, but it remained alive. There is something deeply human about continuing ordinary work while history quietly gathers outside the city walls. Perhaps that is one reason these moments feel so moving. Life does not stop simply because danger appears. People continue living. They always have. Beyond those famous walls, the Ottoman army surrounded Constantinople. The siege had already lasted for weeks. Large camps stretched across the countryside. Supplies arrived. Plans were carefully organized. The city's defenders understood the challenge before them. They also understood the remarkable strength of the walls that had protected Constantinople for centuries. Those walls had turned away countless enemies. Many believed they could do so again. Inside the city, preparations continued calmly. The defenders repaired damaged sections whenever they could. Citizens carried stones, others brought food and water. Everyone contributed in small ways. Not everyone carried a sword. Many simply carried hope. Quiet courage often looks very ordinary. It appears in the baker who continues making bread, the doctor who keeps treating patients, the monk who continues praying, the mother who comforts frightened children. History often celebrates dramatic heroes, but cities survive because ordinary people quietly refuse to give up. As the days passed, uncertainty grew heavier. No one could see the future. Some believed rescue might arrive, others worried that it would not. Rumors spread through narrow streets. One person claimed good news had come from the sea. Another insisted the situation was becoming worse. People listened, wondered, waited. Waiting may be one of the hardest things human beings ever do. There are moments when action feels easier than uncertainty. Yet uncertainty became the city's daily companion. The familiar rhythm of Constantinople slowly changed. Markets opened for shorter hours. Conversations became quieter. Families spent more time together. Churches filled more often. The sound of prayer rose across the city. Not from fear alone, but from hope. Hope that somehow tomorrow might still bring peace. Eventually, after weeks of endurance, the ancient defenses could no longer protect the city forever. The walls that had guarded Constantinople for nearly 1,000 years had reached the end of their remarkable story. After centuries of standing against countless attacks, they could not stand forever. Nothing built by human hands ever truly can. When Constantinople finally fell in 1453, something much greater than a city changed. The last surviving part of the Roman Empire came to an end. Think about that for a moment. The empire begun centuries before by Augustus, the empire that had once ruled nearly the entire Mediterranean, the empire that had built roads stretching across continents, the empire that had survived the fall of ancient Rome itself. It had continued living here, quietly, patiently, for more than 1,000 years. Now its long journey was over. The emotional weight of that moment cannot easily be measured. Buildings can be rebuilt, walls repaired, markets reopened, but the ending of an entire civilization feels different. Generations of memory seem to gather into a single moment. The voices of countless emperors, merchants, monks, teachers, children, farmers, builders. All those ordinary lives that had quietly carried the empire through the centuries. Their story had reached its final page. Yet even in that ending, life did not disappear. Families continued living in the city. Churches remained. Many buildings survived. The streets still echoed with footsteps. The Bosporus continued carrying ships between Europe and Asia, just as it always had. The sunrise still painted the sky with soft colors each morning. History had changed. Nature had not. As evening settled over Constantinople for the last time as the capital of the Roman Empire, the city rested beneath the same stars that had watched over it for centuries. The bells grew quieter. The harbor became still. The candles flickered gently behind ancient walls. An empire had ended, but the city itself continued breathing, carrying within its stones the memory of over 1,100 years of endurance. A quiet reminder that while every empire must one day pass into history, the lives lived within it continue to echo, long after the crowns have disappeared. When we hear that an empire has fallen, it is easy to imagine everything disappearing at once. The flags come down, the rulers are gone, the maps are redrawn, and somehow in our minds the story simply ends. But history is rarely that tidy. An empire can disappear from politics long before it disappears from people's lives. The Byzantine Empire officially came to an end in 1453. Its last emperor was gone. Its government no longer ruled from Constantinople. The Roman Empire, which had lasted in one form or another for nearly 1,500 years, had finally reached its conclusion. And yet, so much remained. If you walked through the city the next morning, the streets were still there. The houses had not vanished overnight. The sea still touched the harbor. The Bosporus still connected Europe and Asia. The sunrise still painted the domes with soft golden light. Life, as it always does, continued. People still woke before dawn. Bread still baked in warm ovens. Children still laughed while running through narrow streets. Neighbors still greeted one another. The empire had ended. The people had not. Perhaps that is one of history's gentlest lessons. Governments may rise and fall. Human life keeps moving forward. One of the strongest things to survive was Orthodox Christianity. For centuries, the Byzantine Empire had been the heart of the Eastern Christian world. Its churches shaped worship. Its monasteries preserved learning. Its priests and monks guided communities through peaceful years and difficult ones alike. That did not suddenly disappear. Churches continued welcoming worshippers. Ancient prayers continued being spoken. Religious festivals still filled the calendar. Icons still glowed beneath candlelight. The traditions carried by generations of believers remained alive. Today, if you visit Orthodox churches in Greece, Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, Georgia, or many other parts of the world, you will still recognize customs that grew and flourished during Byzantine times. The empire is gone. Its spiritual legacy continues. Then there was Roman law. You might not think a collection of old legal books could survive the fall of an empire. After all, laws are not nearly as exciting as castles. They do not sparkle like gold. They rarely appear in adventure stories. Yet they quietly shape everyday life. Remember Emperor Justinian and his great project to organize centuries of Roman law. That careful work proved far more important than anyone living then could fully imagine. Scholars studied those legal writings for centuries. Universities across Europe later used them to teach future judges and lawyers. Many ideas about property, contracts, justice, and government continued influencing legal systems long after the Byzantine Empire itself disappeared. It turns out paperwork can have a surprisingly long life. Perhaps filing cabinets deserve a little more respect. Another treasure that survived was Greek scholarship. For generations, Byzantine scholars had carefully copied ancient books by hand. Works written by philosophers, historians, mathematicians, doctors, and scientists remained safe because patient scribes refused to let them disappear. Imagine copying a book word by word. Then imagine doing it hundreds of times over many years. It sounds exhausting, but thanks to those quiet workers, enormous parts of the ancient world survived. Without them, many famous writings might simply have vanished forever. As conditions in Constantinople became more uncertain during its final years, some scholars decided to leave. They traveled westward, carrying books with them. Not wagons filled with gold, not treasure chests, books, bundles of handwritten manuscripts. To many people, they probably looked like travelers carrying rather heavy luggage. Yet those books became some of the greatest treasures in Europe. When these scholars arrived in cities such as Florence, Venice, and Rome, they shared ancient Greek learning with eager students and thinkers. Many Western Europeans had never seen some of these writings before. Suddenly, forgotten ideas returned. People began studying ancient philosophy again. History, science, literature, languages. Curiosity grew, questions multiplied, knowledge spread. These ideas became part of what we now call the Renaissance. The Renaissance did not happen because of one single event. Many different influences helped create it. But Byzantine scholars played an important role by carrying ancient knowledge safely across Europe. Sometimes the most valuable suitcase contains books instead of jewels. Architecture also continued telling the empire's story. Hagia Sophia remained one of the world's greatest buildings. Its enormous dome inspired generations of architects. Churches throughout Eastern Europe borrowed Byzantine designs, rounded domes, beautiful mosaics, elegant arches. Even after political power changed hands, builders continued learning from Byzantine ideas. Great buildings have a quiet way of teaching people long after their creators are gone. Art survived as well. Byzantine painters developed a style unlike any other. Their icons became famous for peaceful faces, rich colors, and glowing gold backgrounds. These paintings were never meant simply to decorate walls. They invited quiet reflection, prayer, hope. Artists continued creating icons for centuries after the empire disappeared. Many still do today. Walk into an Orthodox church almost anywhere in the world, and you may see artistic traditions that stretch directly back to Byzantine workshops. That is a remarkable kind of survival. Music carried memories too. The beautiful chants sung beneath Byzantine church domes never completely faded. Choirs continued performing these ancient melodies. The notes floated gently through churches, just as they had for generations. Voices connected the present with the past. No emperor was needed for the music to continue. Language also preserved the empire. Greek remained a language of learning and worship across much of the Eastern Mediterranean. Ancient texts continued being read. Poems continued being copied. Stories continued being told. Grandparents shared familiar tales with grandchildren. Teachers explained lessons that had been passed from one generation to the next. History often survives best through conversation. One person teaches another, then another, then another. Looking back, it becomes clear that the Byzantine Empire experienced two different endings. The first was political. Its government disappeared. Its emperor was gone. Its borders no longer existed. That chapter truly ended, but the second story never really stopped. Its culture kept traveling. Its faith kept growing. Its books kept teaching. Its buildings kept inspiring. Its art kept comforting. Its laws kept guiding. Its ideas kept crossing borders, long after its armies no longer could. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson the Byzantine Empire leaves behind. Power can fade, cities can change rulers, maps can be redrawn. Yet knowledge, belief, beauty, and tradition often travel much farther than armies ever do. As the centuries passed, people who had never seen Constantinople still studied its books. They admired its architecture. They sang its music. They prayed before icons painted in its style. Without realizing it, they carried small pieces of the empire into the future. And so, while the Byzantine Empire disappeared from the political map in 1453, it never truly disappeared from human history. Its greatest victories were no longer won by soldiers or emperors. They were won quietly, by teachers, artists, monks, builders, scholars, and ordinary families who continued passing its remarkable inheritance from one generation to the next. Now that our long journey is almost over, let us ask one final question. Why does the Byzantine Empire still matter? After all, it disappeared more than 500 years ago. Its emperors are gone. Its banners no longer fly above the walls of Constantinople. Its borders exist only in old maps and history books, so why should anyone, especially someone trying to peacefully fall asleep, spend time thinking about it? The answer is surprisingly simple, because the Byzantine Empire quietly shaped the world we live in today. Not through one great moment, not through one famous battle, but through more than 11 centuries of steady endurance. That alone is worth pausing to admire. Think about how long 1,100 years really is. It is difficult for our minds to picture. Imagine a family keeping the same house for 11 centuries, generation after generation. Parents, children, grandchildren, then their grandchildren. The family changes, the furniture changes, the language changes, the world outside changes, yet the house remains. That is something close to what the Byzantine Empire achieved. It lasted longer than many civilizations most people remember far more often. It survived changing climates, changing neighbors, changing trade routes, changing ideas, changing technologies. It kept adapting, again and again and again. Perhaps that was its greatest talent. Not conquering, not expanding, adapting. Many powerful empires burned brightly, then disappeared quickly. The Byzantine Empire was different. It was more like a steady candle, not always dazzling, not always dramatic, but remarkably difficult to blow out. For over 1,000 years, it simply refused to disappear. One reason it still matters is because it protected knowledge. Earlier in our journey, we visited quiet monasteries where patient monks copied books by hand. At the time, it probably seemed like ordinary work. One page, then another, one sentence, then another. No cheering crowds, no celebrations, just careful writing. Yet, those quiet hours changed history. Ancient books survived because someone believed they were worth preserving. The writings of philosophers, scientists, doctors, poets, historians, mathematicians. Without those careful copies, much of the ancient world might have faded away forever. Instead, those ideas continued traveling across centuries. Knowledge became a gift passed from one generation to the next. That may be one of the greatest gifts any civilization can leave behind. The empire also protected Europe in ways that are easy to overlook. For centuries, Constantinople stood at the meeting point between continents. Its massive walls guarded one of the most important cities on Earth. Many invading armies reached those walls. Many hoped to move farther west. Often, they did not. The city's defenses delayed, redirected, or stopped countless invasions over hundreds of years. Those extra years mattered. They gave kingdoms farther west more time to grow, more time to organize, more time to develop their own cultures. History is full of quiet moments that shape everything that follows. The walls of Constantinople were one of those moments, not once, but many times. Then there was the empire's unique place between East and West. Few places in history connected so many different worlds. Merchants from Asia arrived carrying silk and spices. Travelers from Europe brought wool, metalwork, and new ideas. Ships crossed the Bosporus every day. Caravans arrived from distant deserts. Different languages filled the markets. Different religions met in the streets. Different customs blended naturally over centuries. Constantinople became far more than a capital city. It became a bridge. Ideas traveled across that bridge. So did inventions, foods, stories, art, music, even fashion. Long before airplanes or the internet connected continents, Constantinople quietly helped people exchange knowledge from one side of the world to the other. Perhaps the empire's most valuable lesson, however, is resilience. That is a word we hear often today, but the Byzantines truly lived it. Whenever life became difficult, they adjusted. When trade routes changed, they found new opportunities. When enemies grew stronger, they relied on diplomacy. When earthquakes damaged buildings, they rebuilt them. When plagues reduced the population, communities slowly recovered. When governments struggled, ordinary people continued planting crops, teaching children, and opening shops. They understood something simple. Life moves forward. You keep going, even when circumstances change, especially when circumstances change. The Byzantine Empire survived because it rarely expected the world to remain the same. It accepted change, then worked patiently within it. That quiet flexibility allowed the empire to outlive many rivals who had once appeared much stronger. There is another lesson hidden here as well. History often celebrates beginnings and endings. The first emperor, the last emperor, the first battle, the final battle. Those moments are certainly important, but they are only tiny pieces of a much larger story. Most of history happens on ordinary days. A teacher explaining a lesson, a baker preparing bread before sunrise, a merchant greeting customers, a monk carefully copying another page, a child learning to read. Those ordinary moments filled nearly every one of the Byzantine Empire's 1100 years. That is where its true strength lived, not only inside palaces, not only behind great walls, but inside everyday lives. Sometimes we remember the Byzantine Empire, only because it eventually fell in 1453. That would be a little like remembering someone's entire life only by reading the last page of their biography. Yes, the ending matters, but so do the 11 centuries that came before it. The builders who raised Hagia Sophia, the farmers who harvested olives, the sailors crossing the Bosporus, the doctors treating patients, the artists painting beautiful icons, the scholars preserving ancient books, the diplomats choosing peace over war whenever they could. All those people deserve to be remembered too. Perhaps that is why the Byzantine Empire continues to fascinate historians today. It reminds us that greatness is not measured only by conquest. Sometimes greatness means lasting. Sometimes greatness means preserving. Sometimes greatness means quietly carrying knowledge through difficult centuries until someone else is ready to receive it. That is exactly what Byzantium did. And now, as our story gently comes to its close, imagine the sun setting once more over Constantinople. The water of the Bosporus glows with warm evening light. Church bells drift softly across the city. Ships rest peacefully in the harbor. The markets slowly empty. Families gather for the evening meal. Candles begin to flicker behind familiar windows. For a brief moment, it almost feels as though the empire is still there. In a way, perhaps it is. Not on modern maps, not under the rule of an emperor, but in the books it saved, the churches it inspired, the art it created, the laws it preserved, the ideas it carried between continents, and in the quiet reminder that strength is not always loud. Sometimes the strongest thing of all is simply enduring, calmly, patiently, and faithfully, for more than 1,100 remarkable years. Return to the peaceful image of Constantinople at dawn. Imagine the city slowly fading into history. Its bells become quieter. Its ships disappear into the morning mist. The markets empty. The walls remain standing in memory. Remind listeners that history is often not made only by dramatic victories or sudden defeats, but by ordinary people living ordinary lives across countless generations.